Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the University of Missouri, St. Louis. My name is Eamon Wall, and I'm the Irish Studies Professor at UMSL Global, and you are most welcome to our event today. Today's event is the final lunchtime event of this academic year. But don't forget, our gala concert on Saturday night brings the Martin Hayes Quartet to the Tuil Performing Arts Centre at 8 p.m. and tickets are available. We'll resume our programming of lectures, readings and music in the fall. This year, in June and July, we will resume our study abroad program in Galway after a hiatus of 2 years due to COVID. Today's program traces Eamon de Valera's time spent in the United States between the end of the 1916 rebellion and the signing of the treaty with the UK in 1921-22. It was a time of great importance and fear and tragedy and tension in Ireland. De Valera, American-born and a veteran of 1916, came to America to rally support. Our speakers today will explore the events in detail. Dave Hannigan will provide the broad picture. Ed Galtman will do the same, though with an additional focus on family history and St. Louis history. Dave Hannigan will present first. Ed Galtman will follow and show his short documentary. The presentations will take about 40 to 45 minutes. We will follow these presentations with a Q&A. Please put questions in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. This is a webinar. Unlike traditional Zoom, you will see the speakers, but they won't see you. This format provides better visual and audio quality and keeps out Zoom bombers. Our first guest speaker today is Dave Hannigan, and we are thrilled to have him here with us this afternoon. Dave teaches at Suffolk Community Colleges in New York and is the author of a number of books, including De Valera in America, The Rebel President and the Making of Irish Independence. He has also written a study on interned Jewish intellectuals, a biography of Terence McSweeney, and Boy Wonder, Tales from the Sidelines of an Irish Childhood, a celebrated memoir about growing up in Cork City. His articles appear frequently in the Irish Times, particularly on American sport. So it's great. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dave Hannigan here today to speak for us.
Thank you very much, Eamon. I really appreciate that introduction, and thank you, Ed and Bob. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. So I'm going to talk about De Valera in America from June 1919 until December 1920. But there's a backstory, as Eamon referred to it. Eamon de Valera was born in America, and at 2.5 years old, his mother, who you can see in the slide here with him, she's much older obviously in this picture, but in 1885, she sent him back to Ireland with his uncle, and he sailed back to Ireland at 2.5 years old and was reared in Limerick. And he only ever saw his mother, I think, twice between that and 1919. In 1907, she had come back to Ireland to offer him to move back to America with her. He turned her down because he had a fledgling teaching career going on then. That was before, obviously, the Rising and the Republican struggle began in earnest, really, around 1916. So that's kind of, he's an American born, as most people would probably have known about him. But what's he doing in 1919? Well, in June of 1919, De Valera is the Privara of the first Dáil, which is the first Irish Parliament, which had been established in January of 1919. Privara is an Irish word meaning Prime Minister, to give you the English version, or Taoiseach, as we would call it today in Ireland. Anyway, he's the leader of the Irish government, but the Irish government is not really in charge of anything. It doesn't have any official standing. It's just a government set up, a rebel government, if you like, set up to show the British we can run our own affairs, we will run our own affairs. It's in defiance of the British. He had been in prison when the government had been set up in January, had been busted out of Lincoln jail in a classic kind of movie plot, a key inside a cake smuggled into Lincoln jail. And since then, he'd returned to Dublin. He'd been in jail in England, returned to Dublin, was on the lam. The British could have arrested him, but didn't, because it would be a publicity coup. And then in June of 1919, De Valera is smuggled aboard a ship out of England called the SS Lapland and sails to New York. He's hidden away in the lamplighter's cabin of the ship. Just to give you some context on that, during the entire 1910s and 1920s, there was a very slick clandestine smuggling route between the British liners that would operate out of Southampton going into New York. It smuggled people, it smuggled guns in the other direction. It was an incredibly, it was kind of spy movie-esque operation that they ran, and he and others benefited from it. So De Valera returned to New York in the lamplighter's cabin when everybody else on the ship, as it sailed into New York Harbor, everybody else on the ship was up on top looking at the skyline of New York, the still growing skyline of New York at that time. And De Valera was hidden down below, rats nibbling at his feet, kind of thing. Not the way you want to return to your homeland. But to add to the air of international man of mystery, he smuggled off the ship that night and goes to meet his men, Harry Boland, another legendary Irish figure who I'll talk about in a second. And he meets them in a back bar in New York City. And now the game is afoot. De Valera is in America. He has come to promote the cause of this rebel Irish government, to try to get legal recognition of it from the American government, and to create awareness of it and to garner publicity for it amongst the American newspapers, and then of course with the American people as well. But as my first slide shows there, here's De Valera and his mother and child reunion. One of the first things any Irish boy does when he's been a long time away from his mother is he goes away and he visits his mom. So he heads upstate. Nobody knows he's in America. He heads upstate to Rochester, New York, which is a good 8-hour trip by train. Even at that point, I would have thought it would take 8 hours. He heads up to Rochester, where his mother Catherine is living, and he's in this kind of gray area for 10 days. Nobody knows he's in America. The only time anybody got wind that he might be there was when the people on the street in Rochester started to gossip and say De Valera's in town, or Catherine's boy is back and he's big news in Ireland, and there's some gossip. But he survives that. He survives that. But he goes to see his mother, and he'll return to see her a couple of times during the 18 months that he's in America, and that's the personal business over with. And then he goes to see this man, this fantastically mustachioed character called Joseph McGarrity. He's an Irish-American success story from Tyrone in Ulster. He was a liquor merchant who owned a newspaper out of Philadelphia, an Irish newspaper out of Philadelphia, was a really big player in Irish-American politics. And McGarrity is very important here, because McGarrity is the guy who says, when De Valera comes into his house in Philly, he gives him a makeover, essentially. McGarrity knows in America, if you're going to call yourself the leader of a country, you got to look like the leader of a country. You got to dress like the leader of a country. So he gives him a whole new wardrobe and sends him out kind of looking like a leader of a country. And then he tells De Valera something I think was very crucial. He says, you can't call yourself the Prevara in America. It's just going to require constant translation and constant questions. You're, from now on, when you leave my house, you are the president of the Irish Republic. And that's what he will call himself for the rest of the trip, for ease of understanding, if you like. And there's one wonderful cameo when De Valera is leaving McGarrity's house to go to New York, where he's going to basically come out and announce his presence in America. And McGarrity he goes to pick up his suitcase, and McGarrity stops him and he says, the president does not carry his own valise. So he wants De Valera to understand that you must come off like a presidential figure from now on, because you're trying to convince the people of America, and by extension the American government, that you are the leader of this country, and this country deserves respect and recognition and all that kind of stuff. So McGarity is a he's a background figure most of the time, but I think he had a huge impact on teaching De Valera political skills and awareness of the political game. So even when you trace the history of Ireland in the decades after this, I think McGarity's imprints on De Valera are very important in the future, in the 20th century history of Ireland going forward. But McGarity in Philly, he also pops into Washington to visit a bishop, and he goes to visit his half brother up in Boston. Nobody yet knows he's in America. He's keeping it on the down low. And then the Harry Boland, who I'm going to show you now on the next slide, announces that De Valera will be giving a press conference at the Waldorf Astoria. The Waldorf Astoria at the time was the greatest hotel and the most luxurious hotel in New York City. And at the Waldorf Astoria was where royalty stayed. When European royalty visited, they stayed in the Waldorf. When presidents visited New York, they stayed there. And again, they spent hugely on putting De Valera up in the Waldorf Astoria for 18 months. And his critics back home will, give all sorts of accusations about the overspending, and they have a point to an extent. But De Valera and his followers would argue he was trying to come across as presidential. Presidents stayed in the Waldorf Astoria, and indeed, the Waldorf Astoria would be labeled the Irish White House by the New York papers, which again I think conveyed a legitimacy to the operation that De Valera was trying to run. So here in this next slide, this is on the roof of the Waldorf Astoria. Sorry, I went one picture too far there. My apologies. Sorry. My apologies. Here we go. So this picture of 6 men on top of the Waldorf Astoria roof. Apologies again. Okay, I'm just going to leave it there for a second. I hope you can see that. This picture, De Valera is at the center of the picture. John Devoy is the older man who he's got his hand on his shoulder. To the left of De Valera, as we look, is Liam Mellows. Then Harry Boland is to the left of him. Next to De Valera on the right is Diarmuid Lynch. And then to the right of Diarmuid Lynch is Dr. Patrick McCartan. This is probably one of the most famous shots of De Valera's time in America. It's you could tell the history of Ireland over about 100 years just through the biographies, I think, of these 6 men. Devoy is old Irish America. He's the struggle going back to the 1860s. De Valera is the 20th century struggle embodied. In this picture with the hand on the shoulder, there's a lovely bond there. It's completely illusory. The 2 men don't get on from the get-go. It's the classic clash between old and new. De Valera is the new generation. Devoy is the old generation. America's Devoy's territory. De Valera is coming over to kind of steal a little bit of his territory. So he's resentful of that. And then around them, you have this quartet of very strong characters who all had big parts to play in the Republican story at this time and going into the 20s. I want to particularly point out Liam Mellows to the left of De Valera, who wouldn't be that well known a character because he's killed in the Civil War afterwards. He's killed by he's anti-treaty and he's killed by the pro-treaty side. He's executed actually. But Liam Mellows is the mastermind of much of De Valera's trip to America. He's like the media savvy logistics expert, the advance party who goes from town to town and city to city ahead of De Valera and ensures wherever De Valera turns up, there's a crowd, there's excitement, there's awareness, and there's newspaper presence. Liam Mellows was basically a bit of a logistical genius. And the fact he was killed I think it was in 1922, robbed the New Ireland of a man who was a really great character and really great skills that he could have brought to bear on a country that was just finding its feet in terms of independence, and what a different country we might have been if people like him had been allowed to live. And to the left of him, Harry Boland is very much De Valera's right-hand man for much of the trip. and they will stay at the Waldorf together, and in one lovely detail, they'll nip around the corner from the Waldorf, the swankiest hotel in New York, and they will go around the corner to play handball in a handball court there in their downtime, which I love. And then Diarmuid Lynch is involved in the Friends of Irish Freedom, a movement which Devoy has used to raise money for the Irish cause in America. They're going to follow with De Valera over that. And then to the right of him is Patrick McCartan, who's the envoy of the new rebel Irish government. He's the envoy of the new Irish government to Washington, D.C. But this picture, unified, great men in America fighting, battling for the campaign to legitimize Irish independence. Unfortunately, this is about as unified as it gets. Later, there will be a terrible split, and Devoy and his right-hand man, Justice Daniel Colohan, who's not in this picture, but Colohan and Devoy will fall out with De Valera in a terrible way. It'll be both sides' fault as far as I'm concerned, and will do great damage to the Irish cause. For those of you who are not Irish or of Irish extract or Irish descent, you might not know, but in Ireland, the great writer Brendan Behan once said, whenever any Irish organization is set up, the first item on the agenda is, what time are we having the split? We have a tendency to fall out with each other, and this, of course, is a great example of this. This picture captures that unfortunate aspect of our personality perfectly. So De Valera gives a great press conference in the Waldorf. He's out now. He's in America. He's announced his intentions. And from there, he's going to traverse the country, speaking to massive crowds, getting huge newspaper. Remember, newspapers were big in 1919, 1920. He was front page news everywhere he went. And this picture here of Irish Day at Fenway Park, it's his first actual major public event. Fenway Park was only 7 years old, home of the Boston Red Sox. Of course, you'd know that, in St. Louis, a baseball town, if I'm correct. And he appeared in Fenway Park on a Sunday afternoon. The entire stadium, the field and the bleachers and everything was full. They had to shut the door an hour before he spoke. And to give you an idea, I think it was 30,000 were in there. At that time, the Red Sox, or the season before, the Red Sox, who still had Babe Ruth then, used to average 6,000 at home games. So De Valera got many, many multiples of that crowd. They came from all over New England to hear him speak, and it was really a publicity triumph, and it showed you the appetite to hear De Valera talk and the appetite to hear him talk about Ireland. He wasn't the only speaker that day. There was lots of Irish-American luminaries from Boston. Obviously, Boston's a very Irish town. So there was lots of speeches, lots of bands playing. It was a real colorful, majestic moment. And again, part of this that I think you must understand is what's the point of these set pieces, these enormous public rallies? Part of it is so that the British can see what the appetite is like in America, what the support is like in America for an Irish Republic. Now, to put that in some context, he's trying to get the American government to recognize Ireland. He's never going to achieve that, partly because, of course, it's 1919 and Britain and the US have just fought a war together, and they have that bond, and you're not going to shatter that bond, no matter how big your publicity campaign is and how successful. But to be fair, if you look at, as I did when I was writing this book, a lot of the traffic between London, the cables between London and New York and London and Washington, he was really annoying the British. The British were very annoyed. Questions were asked in the House of Commons. Why is this guy who's on the lam being able to speak in public? And it's not just speaking. He's getting the freedom of the city in lots of American places. He's invited to City Hall. He gets the freedom of the city. He gets the freedom of the city in New York, in fact, later on. But this is the first event, this picture in Fenway Park. And here you see him. This is a live shot of De Valera speaking. And I want to, again, myself and Eamon, we grew up in Ireland in the 60s and 70s, and De Valera was a colossal figure in Irish political life and cultural life, and he was not a sexy character in any way. In fact, he was the very opposite of that. He was a censorious man who kind of cut out a lot of the fun out of Ireland. But why I'm mentioning that is he was a rock star. in America in 1919. You know, people waited outside hotels, excuse me, to touch the hem of his garment. Women fainted when De Valera walked into view. It's astonishing for anybody who knew the old De Valera and De Valera's Ireland, which was a grim and grey place before television kind of thing, before color television came along. He was sexy. He was a rock star. In fact, when he ends up in San Francisco, he's arriving at an event, and 100 yards from the hotel, a group of men stop the car, make the driver turn the engine off, and they attach ropes to De Valera's car so they can tow him the last 100 yards to the speaking engagement in a hotel, because it was an honor for them to do that for this man. There was a symbolism. They wanted to drag him where they were going. So you know, that's an important thing to understand, I guess, how big he was in America at this time over the course, especially of the first 12 months. And here's De Valera and Harry Boland in New York, and they're sitting in a beautiful car from the period. And I threw up this slide because I want to talk about the luxury in which they traveled and the luxury where they stayed. This was around the time Woodrow Wilson was crisscrossing America, trying to promote the Treaty of Versailles, and De Valera often stayed in whatever hotel Woodrow Wilson had stayed in whatever city he was visiting. And there's one cameo, and unfortunately I couldn't lay my hands on the photograph, where De Valera goes to Newport, Rhode Island, which is a very swanky, Gilded Age kind of old money Brahmin town in Rhode Island, on the water in Rhode Island. And he goes to Rhode Island for a speaking engagement, and he sails down the Narragansett Bay in this super yacht called the Editha, which would have been in 1919 the equivalent of one of these Russian oligarchs' super yachts that we see being impounded around the world today. And De Valera was on that, sailing beautiful Narragansett Bay up there in New England. But why I mention it is because while he was doing that, hanging with the rich and you know, the famous, if you like, that very weekend, a lot of his peers in Dublin and all over the country were being rounded up by the British, manhandled and chained, or manacled actually, to the backs of trucks and being driven to Dublin as prisoners. And you know, later they'd contrast, you know, we were suffering and this guy was sailing around, you know, with the blue bloods of New England. But again, De Valera's point would be he was trying to drum up financial interest in this. He was trying to drum up he was trying to drum up financial support. He was trying to just drum up political support, and you know, that he had to go where the money was, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. So he went on several cross-country trips, two main ones, and a couple of mini kind of jaunts. And here's one of them. In one of them, he ends up in Notre Dame University. Obviously, the University of Notre Dame, the famous. Most famous Catholic college in America, I would venture, and obviously a school synonymous with Irish through the nickname. As De Valera goes there, he plants a tree, the Tree of Liberty, and why I show this picture is this is him speaking there, is because Murray Sperber, who wrote a very fine history of Notre Dame football, Murray Sperber argues that De Valera's visit in 1919 is what cemented the nickname of the Fighting Irish to the football team at Notre Dame. Before then, they were called the Nomads, the Hoosiers. They had a couple of different, the Ramblers. They had a couple of different nicknames, including the Fighting Irish. But Sperber's contention, and he knows a hell of a lot more about Notre Dame football than I do, said his contention is that De Valera's visit really whipped up the Irishness of the whole place, and the you know, after he left, it was the Fighting Irish or nothing, and they became the Fighting Irish from then on, which is ironic because obviously that brand is, if you're into sports branding and sports marketing, that's worth a hell of a lot of money. That's worth a hell of a lot of money to that university today. So Notre Dame was one. Obviously, there's many other stops, and Ed will talk in particular about this one, but. Here we have De Valera in Notre Dame, and then here's the very famous picture of him in Wisconsin wearing the Native American headdress given to him by the Chippewa Nation. And again, it was a really, he had to go a long way to meet the Chippewa, and they gave him They made him an honorary chief and made him gave him the title of Chief Dressing Feather, I think is how I won't try to translate it, or I won't try to speak it in the original, but I think it translates as Chief Dressing Feather. And this picture of De Valera, again, in terms of media coverage or newspaper coverage, this featured prominently in newspapers, drummed up the cause, drummed up publicity for the cause, got the headlines and got the column inches at a time when I think it's difficult for us to understand because of the multimedia world we live in. But in that world, newspaper coverage was everything in 1919 and 20. And these kind of, you might call it gimmickry, or you might call it symbolic because of two oppressed peoples, the Native Americans and the Irish. The symbolism there is obvious, but it certainly worked in terms of promoting it. And just as a kind of an aside, one of De Valera's sons later wrote a book about growing up as a De Valera, and he mentioned that him and his brothers used to reenact scenes from cowboy Western movies, but they would use the Chippewa stuff that their father had got when he was in Wisconsin at that time. So there's a chief dressing feather of the Chippewa Nation. Here's De Valera in Los Angeles. This is a minor league baseball stadium. He was supposed to speak at the Shriner Auditorium, but one of the newspapers in LA was dead set against De Valera and against the Irish. It was an anti-De Valera. They took an anti-De Valera stance. They got the Shriner to refuse him permission to speak at the Shriner Auditorium. He ended up speaking at this minor league baseball stadium to a bigger crowd than he would have had if it was indoors. But I think it is worth mentioning that it was not all De Valera, rah, 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 he's the greatest, wherever he went. There were pockets of resistance. There were particularly American Legion clubs that protested against him and spoke out against him, didn't want him in their town because De Valera would have been one of the men in 1916 who held a rebellion against the British rule in Dublin because they felt that Britain fighting a war against the Germans was their opportunity. American soldiers or American veterans of World War I, at least some of them, saw that as they did not like that and they resented that. So there was criticism of him in various places, especially in the Deep South as well, when he travels across the Deep South later in his time in America. But he's in LA, he speaks at this stadium, but a very strange thing, and it's funny because Ed is going to show us this wonderful video in a few minutes. But when De Valera was in LA, he actually filmed a movie or was involved in a movie called For the Freedom of Ireland, which when I was writing this book, I drove myself nuts for 2 years trying to find an extant copy of the short film in which De Valera features in cameos, but it's kind of loosely based on De Valera's life and the battle for Irish freedom. And I've tried the various archives and I could come up with publicity stills for it and everything, but I never could actually find a living copy of the movie For the Freedom of Ireland. And it was, it was eventually shown in American cinemas. It took a while. It was shown more like in 1920, but he filmed it that first year when he visited LA. And again, De Valera is not. We don't think of him as Hollywood. He was anti-Hollywood and anti-movies, and he was a censor. He censored the Ireland that we lived in. And the irony is, he was smart enough to see Hollywood could help his cause back then. And again, one point of this too is that once he lands in America, there is a never-ending procession of people to the Waldorf Astoria offering commercial opportunities. They want books, they want songs, they want plays. All they want is De Valera's name attached to them and the name of Ireland attached to them. And they turn down almost all of those, except for they accept a couple, and obviously this For the Freedom of Ireland, the Holy Grail, the missing De Valera movie was one aspect of it. Here's De Valera. He looks a bit like Harry Potter there, if you ask me. That's him arriving in Chicago in June of 1920 for the Republican National Convention. And just to preface that, just before that, De Valera and Devoy have a big showdown at a hotel in New York City where the two growing factions of Irish of the Irish political movement in America split. And it's the classically Irish split. They have a 10-hour debate in which they call each other all sorts of names, accuse each other of all sorts of crimes against the Irish people and financial shenanigans, all sorts of name calling for 10 hours. And it's actually a comic scene because Devoy is almost deaf. And half the time he can't hear what's being said about him. Some of it's being whispered in his ear by his close advisors. But that scene in the hotel, which prefaced this arrival at this train station, is because they're fighting over who should go to Chicago to represent the cause of Ireland at the Republican National Convention, because they want the Republican Party to make Irish independence a platform or part of their party platform in the presidential election. Long story short, they have a massive fight. At the end of 10 hours of debate, a bishop takes the mic and orders everybody in the room down on their knees to pray together, which would be a lovely bookend to the whole thing, except, that was cosmetic. Really, they hated each other and they split. There was 2 Irish groups went to Chicago, one led by De Valera, one led by Colohan, arguing the cause of Ireland. Imagine the Republicans saying, what the hell, we have to meet 2 separate Irish groups to talk about Irish independence because they can't agree on what Irish independence is or how to fight for it. But that comic aspect aside, De Valera actually played a very smart game at that convention. He had torchlit parades. They put out a daily newspaper promoting the Irish cause. Here we have, this is a clip from the Chicago Tribune. De Valera rivals the GOP because De Valera's, the media savvy operation that De Valera and his acolytes led in Chicago that week was so smart that one of the newspapers had a cartoon that I've never been able to properly cut and paste from the newspaper, which basically said, in the cartoon, De Valera says, no, I'm not actually running for president, because he had become such a dominant figure or such a high profile figure at the Chicago Convention. But in the heel of the hunt, they of course did not achieve anything because they presented a split platform, and the Republicans, didn't do anything to help them. Similar story with the Democrats in California later that year. And then before I finish, the one thing I want to talk about, I may have concentrated a little too much about the media, about the publicity aspect, how popular he was, how big it was, because it was really sophisticated for 1919, 1920 to be pulling off this kind of, this sort of scale of spectacle across America. And again, Mellows and Kathleen O'Connell, De Valera's secretary, his personal secretary, also deserves some credit for that. She was a brilliant organizer as well. She was more of a background figure and very loyal to him throughout. So that's the aspect of it. They failed to get political recognition, but then the one thing they did do was this. If you just see these, this is a bond certificate. In January 2020, they started selling bonds in the Republic of Ireland. This was slightly difficult because the Republic of Ireland didn't legally exist. So as critics pointed out, you're selling bonds in something that doesn't legally exist. To show you the appetite for helping Ireland in America, regardless of the legal dubiety of this whole business, there were 300,000 individuals purchased bonds in the New Ireland. Some spent as little as $5, some spent 10, and here we have a $25 bond. So you were basically giving De Valera money, or giving the Irish group, Irish associations, this money in the hope of helping the republic that did not quite yet legally exist. $5 million was raised, over $5 million. The money would be, because De Valera and Devoy fell out, De Valera ran the Friends of Irish Freedom, Devoy ran the Friends of Irish Freedom, excuse me. I'm watching the clock, so I'm speaking faster in a classic bad professor move. So Devoy ran the Friends of Irish Freedom, De Valera ran the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic, a very clumsy name. And the dispute about this money would drag on way into the 20s. Lots of legal action. De Valera would come back later and get people to give some of the money to him to help fund the Irish Press newspaper, which would become the official organ of De Valera's political party, Fianna Fáil, for much of the rest of the 20th century up until the 1990s. And that was that was actually scandalous, the way that he did that. before I finish my overview, I just want to say, you know, he kept up the momentum really right up until December of 2020, and then he was smuggled back out of America again in the same way that he came. But before I finish, I just want to, when he was on board the ship just before he left, when he was on board the ship right at the end, De Valera wrote a note that was then released after the ship had already landed in England and he was safely smuggled back to Dublin. The note that De Valera wrote to the American people was published in the newspapers, and I'm just going to read it for you. Land of the free and home of the brave, wrote De Valera, farewell. May you ever remain as I have known you, land of the generous-hearted and kindly. May you stand through time as they would have who love you, liberty's chosen champion. And may you never know yourself the agony of a foreign master's lash. So that was De Valera's last word. 18 months on, he goes home. And one thing before I finish, what he learned in America, I think, made him a much more formidable politician, much more capable character, and in many ways was the foundation of his becoming the most influential character in Irish politics for basically the next 40 or 50 years. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was a terrific introduction to De Valera in America. It's an amazing story, and one that you tell with great aplomb. For people in our audience, Dave's book on the subject, De Valera in America, The Rebel Presidents and the Making of Irish Independence, is a terrific read and full of detail. All right, our next speaker then is Ed Galterman, and Ed is a St. Louis native, and we're delighted to have him here today. Ed Galterman is a writer, producer, director, historian, and preservationist. His documentary on De Valera is a labor of love that combines the histories of Ireland and the US. It's also, I think, a family story, though family stories are also the stories of larger families that include both the places the families come from, and nations. Today's event was Ed's idea, so we are happy at UMSL Global to have finally brought this idea to life. Ed will introduce the documentary briefly first, and then we will screen the documentary, and then at the end of the documentary, we will have time then for questions and answers. So welcome, Ed.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, but we don't have your video. Can you just turn on your video?
Well, I'm not sure. It says I'm supposed to start a video, so here we go.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dave, thank you so much. First of all, we only have one visual that you used in your presentation, and thank God that I used in mine. And so that's great. And secondly, I have to remind you how much the Cardinals took care of the Yankees and Boston and all the rest of it. I didn't want to open with baseball, certainly. My grandfather and De Valera were friends. My guess is they both played handball either near the hotel or at the New York Athletic Club, where my grandfather lived for 4 years as he served first his country, and then he had a chance to help the Irish cause. We have to remember, I believe, that De Valera was a curiosity in this country. Nobody knew much about him at all. By the time he left, to me, he was among the top 3 or 4 speakers of my grandfather's Nations Forum series. And that included presidents, future presidents, Leonard Wood from Boston, some incredible speakers. Yes, his style was different. His style was quite different. Another thing, let's remember that none of his speeches, Dave and Eamon, were recorded when they were done. The recording industry was not there yet. And even the film that we're looking for, and by gosh, we're going to find it. Somehow we're going to find that film. My guess is it was a silent film because the first sound movie was in 1926. That you commended Mellows is very significant. In a sense, my grandfather was a Mellows in that he toured opera stars to Liberty Loan concerts all over the country. That was one of his assignments. In fact, in the same year, the year Dev is appearing in our St. Louis Coliseum, Guy Golderman had brought John McCormick, the greatest tenor. In fact, he was here twice. I did not know McCormick started out in opera, but he started out with the Chicago Opera Company. My grandfather brought him to the Coliseum in 11, but in 19, the year Dev was here and would appear at the Coliseum, he brought McCormick, Caruso, and De Valera all within the same few months. However, Dave, I don't think my grandfather was in St. Louis for the trip that I will describe briefly. This has been such a male-oriented presentation so far. I'd like to acknowledge this beautiful Irish lady here just for a minute. And I'm going to challenge some of the viewers as to who is she? Where is she going? She's flying somewhere. Where is she landing? And just tell us who she is. And anyone who gets it, just type it on in. And I will send you either toasted ravioli from St. Louis or Ted Drew's ice cream. With that, this quarter Irisher, who you're going to see mispronounces a name or two in the documentary, we're going to now do something that I think honors Guy Golterman, because after De Valera left this country, his voice stayed, and his voice is with us today. And I think his message actually fits today as it fit that time. So Bob, let her roll.
My dear husband, we miss you very much and await your return. Guy Jr. has grown quite tall. Eddie is walking. They are fine. We are fine and are waiting for you to come home. But first, there is one more voice to include in your wonderful series. One more voice for freedom to present to the American people. Then, come home to us.
No, the Irish do not hate England. The Irish desire peace with England as with the rest of the world. It is not the Irish who are disturbing the world's peace. It is not they who are the aggressors, it is the British. The British can end this question in an hour by withdrawing their troops. The Irish on their side can end it only by sacrificing their nationhood and their national right to self-determination and freedom. Which are to yield? Ireland would have to give up what is hers, her own, her very life. England would only have to give up that, the possession of which is not vital to her, and to which in any case her title is but a robber's title. Ireland cannot will her own annihilation. It has cost her 750 years of blood and tears to hold on to her individual national existence, and she will not relinquish it now. The Irish Republic exists. Its shackles serve but to make its reality the more concrete. It is not destroyed when individuals or nations plunge their heads into the sand and say they cannot see it. It is there, recognized or not, and it can be destroyed only by the power that brought it into being, the will of the Irish people. It is fortunate that the question of the recognition of the Republic arises at this time. It is doubly fortunate that America is strong enough to decide upon it boldly without fear in the way its conscience prompts. Ireland's cause is not Ireland's cause only, it is the cause of the world. It is the cause of right and of justice and of true democracy everywhere. If I were an American, I would make it the supreme object of my life to win for my country the distinction of securing now for mankind in peace what millions have died for vainly in war. Ireland's claim furnishes America the opportunity. This question of recognition is distinctly an American question, a question solely of American policy. The decision is yours, and yours only. Yours to say whether you shall continue as in the past to recognize the government of might in Ireland, or begin now to recognize the government of right. The decision on Ireland will put on record forever America's own answer to the questions of our precedent. Shall the military power of any nation or group of nations be suffered to determine the fortunes of peoples over whom they have no right to rule except the right of force? Shall strong nations be free to wrong weak nations and make them subject to their purposes and interests? Shall peoples be ruled and dominated by arbitrary and irresponsible force, or by their own will and choice? Shall there be a common standard of right and privilege for all peoples and nations, or shall the strong do as they will, and the weak suffer without redress? The Paris Peace Treaty, the international diplomats and the international financiers have not answered these questions as the American people intended them to be answered. It is now a question for the American people to answer them for themselves in their own spirit and in their own regard. Their answer will live in history as the epoch of a new era, or as the knell of the hopes of all who believed that mankind had at last learned its lesson.
In recognition, St. Patrick's Day and memorial address on the death of Terence McSwiney are duplicated and distributed as the 28th, 29th, and 30th releases of the Nations Forum series. As De Valera departed for home in December of 1920, his voice still beamed out in America, in living rooms, in stores, and on the radio. How many were sold? How much did they raise at 25 cents royalties per $2 sale? Did these recordings advance the recognition of Ireland by the U.S.? That's another story. Also in December of 1920, Guy Golderman returned to St. Louis, to his family, to his municipal theater in Forest Park, to resume producing grand operas and presenting classical artists in concert. But he would also be a man of the eastern cities, one of many Midwesterners who contributed much in difficult times.
Welcome home.
Am I back on? Hello? Hello?
Yes, that's great.
Yes.
That's great. Thank you.
One friend to another. It's the way my grandfather worked. He worked with people and for people. I think neither one of them cared a great deal about politics or politicians for politics and politicians' own sake. But I think they knew how to, maneuver and handle. And De Valera's challenge was remarkable because he had to target so many different interests while maintaining his main goal, and that was U.S. recognition of Ireland, which was a step process. I'll take just a few minutes. I'm not watching the clock, so buzz me about the day in St. Louis, which had to be, in the narrowest sense, the most important day for Irish Catholic St. Louis in history. And I'll put that up against the Pope's visit. I'll put that up against Fulton Sheen starting the propagation of the faith. And I'll put that up against the first Mass in English. Because on that same day, the probably the most well-known international voice against German oppression, Cardinal Mercier of Belgium, was in St. Louis on that day. And of course, he would be hosted by John Cardinal Glennon, one of the most beloved American prelates in the eyes and hearts of the American people. And on the same day, the President of Ireland. So immediately, logistically, they divided their audience. But they divided their audience only in terms of their personal appearances, and the parades had to go in different directions. It was very wise that they not meet, because it could be confusing to the press. The press is very easily confused anyway, and it could be confusing to people. Their messages were not exactly the same, but their messages were very powerful, and to have them in St. Louis on the same day. Dev and the group came in from Springfield the night before. They arrived early in the morning at Union Station, and Bolin or his secretary, John Newman, said, let's let him sleep. So they get in about 6:30, and they let him sleep till about 8 or 8:15, and then the whole group gets into cars. They come out of the station. He wisely brought with him two Protestant ministers. And I think that was brilliant. I don't know if they accompanied him the whole tour, but one of his 10 points was that U.S. recognition of Ireland is not religious. It is not a religious issue. It is a political issue, or unfortunately, a military issue at that point. So he also brought his secretary, Newman, three gentlemen and then Harry Bolin, three gentlemen from St. Louis. As you indicated, they monitored what went on in Springfield to roll over what they learned, apply that in St. Louis, and they included Mr. Anyway, I'll get the names, but anyway, they let him sleep. It was Robert Emmett Kane. Dr. Kane was an official host, Michael Cullinane, and the fellow that escorted us to the promised land, Arthur J. Donnelly, the embalmer, the mortician. And then Harry Bolin was on this trip. I don't know if Harry made all 30. Maybe they switched off, whoever accompanied the De Valera. So to keep the two principals apart, they went over to the Jefferson Hotel, had breakfast. I have no idea who was at the breakfast. Mayor Thiel would introduce him that night, would receive Dev at City Hall, and the formal invitation came from Luke E. Hart. And Luke Hart, young people, you can Google Luke Hart. He was probably the most honored Catholic layman in U.S. history. But in any case, after breakfast around 9 or so, they took Dev on a 50 motorcade tour of the city. The neighborhoods, the business district, they would go west, and then the good cardinal would go east. So the two motorcades would not hit. I want to credit the women of the Irish Freedom League, whatever their title was. They put flowers on all 50 cars. So 50 cars head out Lindell Boulevard to Washington U, or the Hilltop. They didn't stop at the university. They took a left and went into Forest Park. They drove by the Art Museum, which was a gift of the World's Fair. They drove by the St. Louis Zoo. And then Dev said, well, let's drive by this municipal theater that Mr. Golderman told me about, that they opened 2 years ago. So they drove by the Muni. But coming out of the park, he made their only one of two stops. He stopped on Euclid Avenue at St. John's Hospital. And the reason he stopped at St. John's is that's where all the Irish doctors and Irish nurses birthed all the Irish babies of St. Louis. And I think very likely, I can't verify it, but we lived at 310 South Euclid, right across from the hospital. So my grandmother, who we saw in the video, who was voiced by Susie Wall, a very good friend, and the production was done by Barlow in St. Louis. I think my grandmother was waving a homemade tricolor, because I don't think they were printing them in quantity then. And my father and my uncle were standing on the front stoop. So to shorten my formal presentation and hoping for some really good discussion and questions, he made 5 appearances. He made 5 talks. He wound up in the St. Louis Coliseum that night before 7,000, while the good Cardinal drew 7,000 out at the St. Louis Cathedral. I think the press were given really good shots at all of these dignitaries that day. Whether they could all put it together, I don't know. But the Globe Democrat account of that whole day was quite remarkable. So here they are at the Coliseum. The Episcopal minister, I mean, he got a standing ovation. Whatever he said, I don't know. They were very hard on Lloyd George, extremely hard on Lloyd George, and he kind of maybe deserved it at the time. One of the speakers, a man by the name of Walsh, who may have come over from Kansas City to then, as Deb was then going to Kansas City, called for the U.S. to end economic aid to Great Britain. So they were pretty tough. And again, 7,000 people at the Coliseum. How many he actually reached over that whole day, I don't know. But I believe when De Valera reached the heartland and he got away from some of the controversies on the coast, I believe he breathed a sigh of relief. I believe he confirmed that he needed to be in America at that time, though he would be criticized later. I don't think De Valera cared about posterity at all. I don't think any of those leaders had 1 minute to think about how they would be treated by history. They would have no control over it. And to me, they were all heroes at that time. Whatever happened later, they were fighting impossible, absolutely, totally impossible battles. And as the line from The King and I goes, they did their utmost best. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ed. And it's wonderful to have the picture from that begins with Dave on the ship and De Valera being brought over, and we get this and we get this kind of more global view of De Valera in America, and then we get Ed's family connection and De Valera in St. Louis. And of course, I think I suppose all history is family history in a sense when it comes down to it. So thank you both for these great presentations. So Dave has the first question to ask.
No, I just have a comment.
There's another question. There's one question already in the Q&A. So I'm looking to our other participants to type questions into the Q&A, please. So Dave, you go ahead first.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it to Ed, like when I wrote that book, I read versions of this speech that you just gave us, or like that you gave the audio of. I read maybe a couple of hundred versions of that speech, and to actually hear him speaking it was so fantastic. I read it in newspapers and lots of clippings of it, and read it like, because he gives versions of the same speech over and over again. But just to hear his voice delivering it is absolutely fantastic. And just thank you.
Just amazing. And every time I hear it, now let's remember they had to write that speech for the Nations Forum, and they had to keep it to like 4 minutes or so. And so in April of 19 or 20, my grandfather took him into Aeolian Hall of perfect acoustics. So they recorded the first two, St. Patrick's Day and in recognition in April in Aeolian Hall. They then took the master and sent it to Columbia Graphophone in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Now, they had done the purging and they'd done all these others, so they knew exactly how to put these together. But again, there was no editing. He had to say it once through, and then if he made a mistake, they had to say it again. Now, all of these recordings are in the Library of Congress. You can go on your cell phone and listen to them. I was just thrilled to be able to put visuals to this, and to I think that broadens a lot. But thank you, Dave.
Thank you.
Okay, let me go to the question. So we have two questions from Pat Sheehan for Ed, I think. What is the actual date of the St. Louis visit?
That was October 24, 1919. October 24. The Globe Democrat coverage was on the 25th, and they did a whole spread where at that time they published the total speech, or the total speeches. I was just able to access the Globe. As you know, we have now digitized those, and I do a great deal of my research on my grandfather's pursuits at the Jefferson and at the Mercantile on the campus of UMSL, and have been doing that for years. So it was in October. The Nations Forum recordings were, his edition was almost 11th hour, Dave. I mean, they were booked. Ev was probably booked, ready to go back. And then McSweeney died. And so they added a third. They recorded that. And so it became a 3 series. And at 25 cents, per sale, hopefully they raised a lot of money. Thank you for that question.
And Pat also asked about where she could find pictures of the St. Louis visit, but I suppose they would be in the Mercantile Library too, right?
Yes, both the Post and the Globe. Yes, you kind of have to search for those, or maybe they can send them to you. But there's so much of this is applicable today. It's almost scary, some of the things that are going on. But yes, that's a great research tool.
Yeah, and thanks so much, Ed, for the shout out for the Mercantile Library on UMSL's campus, because it's one of our treasures. If any audience haven't been there today, it's the oldest private library west of the Mississippi, and it was originally downtown, but Blanche Tuhill brought it onto our campus a number of years ago, and it's an amazing resource for the history of this place we live in.
You're welcome.
And if you want to go there, there are tours to it, and you can go on a guided tour. So we have another question. All right, and it says to me, thanks, Eamon, a wonderful presentation. Pat Sheehan, Stella's husband from the World Trade Center, and of course, Pat I know from the Hibernians, and so thanks so much for being there today. While we're waiting for another question, I'll ask Dave. Once De Valera was back in Ireland, and say after 1932, and when he became kind of was running things, did he still keep up this intense connection with America? Or was there a falling away, or were the bridges that had been burned ever were things fixed up?
Well, I mean, as I alluded to there at the end, he basically comes over here to get the money, to get access to the money to create the Irish Press, and then he's later invited to address the Houses of Congress. And he obviously refers to his time there and his Americanness, I suppose, as well. But my contention is like, when I wrote that, was that I really felt like America made him, America was a more sophisticated political arena, like as Ed said, you know, you have to appeal across a broad spectrum of people, and you know, how do you appeal to so many people? And I think like he got schooled a little bit in America at different times by different people, like Devoy even and Colin a couple of times, and I think he learned from it. I think it was a, you know, it was a great hothousing of his political instincts, and it made him much more the formidable kind of man that bestrode Irish history for the next 40, 50 years. And I often think that America was neglected in terms of, like, when people told the De Valera story, certainly before the last, it's been acknowledged much more in the last 15 years. There was recently a documentary on Irish, TG Cahir, the Irish language TV station, did a 2-part documentary about De Valera in America, and which I think is available online actually, and has subtitles and stuff. So there's much more of an acknowledgement that that America was a significant part in his political shaping, in his political formation, and it made him the, you know, he has this reputation for being savvy and cute, you know, savvy and kind of having political nous. I think that he learned that in America, and also learned like about media manipulation and the power of the press. You know, there was no mistake that when he went home and was on the outs that he wanted to found a newspaper. He knew a newspaper was key to getting the message out there. I mean, that's the story of politics today, isn't it? Just controlling the message and controlling the organ by which people get information.
Yeah, very good. And do we have any other questions out there from? We've a comment. We've a comment from Jean Eckridge in the chat. Very informative and impressive. So thank you so much, Jean, for that. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? All right. Okay. Very good. So I just have one final comment, I suppose, before we go. I was taken, as Ed mentioned too, by listening when we listen to De Valera's speech about the role of America in the world and all of that, how relevant it is today, right? It's as if he's speaking about events happening today. And of course, a lot of things that were said maybe 100 years ago are of no interest, are completely irrelevant today. But some things that were said have this kind of have this important kind of resonance. So I think for our audience today, and particularly perhaps for our students who are in the audience today, it's wonderful to see. To hear this story. And of course, De Valera in America, as Ed points out and as Dave points out, is, if nothing else, it's just a wonderful story. And but it's also a story with a heft and a relevance and a power to it. So on behalf of everybody at UMSL Global, I just want to say to Dave and to Ed how grateful we are for your presentations, for giving the time to speak to us. And also, of course, we are moving towards centenaries. You know, we're part of many centenaries. So 1922, of course, is one of those. So I would remind you to keep up, to follow both Ed and Dave on social media. If you Google them, both, you know, you'll find out a lot of the things that they're doing, the books that they're writing, and etc. And you can also catch Dave a lot writing for the Irish Times. But usually when we have events on campus, we can give a big cheer and we can bang tables and everything. Thank you. It's not quite as good online. So, but anyway, just to say on behalf of UMSL Global, thank you so much. And this is our last of our lectures during the year, and we are thrilled that both of you could give these presentations that were so fantastic. And my colleague Bob Ell has asked me to remind everybody again, if you want tickets for the Martin Hayes Quartet on Saturday night, that you can go to toohill.universitytickets.com. And the concert is also available for live streaming if you prefer just to watch it from home. We will put this event, today's event, up on YouTube. So if anybody wants to watch it again, please feel free to do so, or to recommend it to your friends and colleagues, and it will be up there on the UMSL Global page. So that is at the end of it for today. Thank you on behalf of UMSL Global and our community.
Thank you very much.
Good to see you. Going to the concert. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Ed.
You are most welcome. You are most welcome.